Good evening, everybody. May I have your attention, please? So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Cameron Hepburn. I'm a professor of environmental economics here. And it's my pleasure this evening, great pleasure, to welcome Professor Dieter Helm, who is a professor at Oxford University, a fellow of New College, chair of the Natural Capital Committee, associate editor of the Oxford Review of Economic Policy, and the list goes on, including non-executive director of Aurora Energy Research. And I was talking with Dieter at lunch about how he'd like me to introduce him. And I mooted various possibilities that I thought he might find rather embarrassing. And his first response to this was, just remember, Cameron, that I'm a Scorpio. And Scorpios have tails that do things. And his second response was that the best introductions are short introductions. Now, I found that far more compelling. So I will make it a short introduction. But what I do want to say is that those who know Dieter will know that he's not only very clever, extremely shrewd, very forceful, and always has a habit of investigating exactly the right questions at the right time. He's ferociously independent, and I think of him as kind of the leading example, not just of an energy policy or a utilities policy professor, but as a kind of professor of PPE, really, of politics, philosophy, and economics, and the best of putting those three things together. But he's here tonight to talk about the cost of energy and the Helm Review. I guess you really have to have not been listening to the press to have missed the Helm Review. It was yet again in the FT in their editorial a couple of days ago. And the remit of the review is pretty simple. It's how do we reduce costs in the power system while meeting our security of supply needs and our climate change objectives under the Climate Change Act. So it's a big question. It's a big review. It's 250 plus pages of review, and it's been widely discussed and analysed, and you too can have your say, because the government has released a consultation effectively on the Helm Review, which closes on the 5th of January. So if, having heard Dieter this evening, you decide that you wish to have your say, you can do so. The last thing I'll say before inviting Dieter to the podium is that if you want more of him after this lecture, you should read this incredibly readable book, Burnout, on the future, or in some ways, the non-future of the fossil fuel industry. So with that, Dieter, it is my pleasure to invite you to the podium for the Cost of Energy Review. Thank you.
Cameron, thank you very much. You said you would keep it short, and you failed. Since you asked for a Scorpio response. Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. What I'd like to do is take you through the main components of the review report, which I've written, and I want to give you an impression, if you like, of a comprehensive whole. So there are lots of bits and pieces I'm going to discuss, which I've covered in the review, but what I want to do is really provide a framework and a package as to how our electricity sector can, should, and can be aided to evolve through to about 2030. So the review is very much about a long-term framework, and that's absolutely deliberate, although it does have some immediate things that governments ought to do. But before I start, let me just give you a couple of words of context. I mean, everyone will be aware that the prices of electricity, as opposed to the costs, have been hugely politically controversial over the last now 4 or 5 years. The Labour Party proposed a price cap. That was one of Ed Miliband's most popular policies. I think 70 to 80% approval of that policy back several years ago now, before the 2015 elections. And since then, there has been one controversy after another about electricity prices. It's clearly remained high on the political agenda. And after the start of my review, I think it's after the start of my review, the government brought forward draft legislation to impose a price cap. Now, the excitement and the real live politics of a direct intervention into the market are often not a good context to think about where one wants to go in the long run and to think about a proper framework for energy policy. But at least they have the merit of getting people's attention. And the Conservative Party committed in the manifesto, its last manifesto, to have a cost of energy review. And what political parties do is they tend to go through their manifesto and hope they can tick as many boxes as possible. And since they said they were going to have a cost of energy review, well, they had to have one. It's not at all clear that anyone had thought through how this would evolve, but it fell to me to carry this out. And in carrying this out, I was determined that it would be independent. And early on, I insisted that no draft of the review would be seen by any civil servant or politician ahead of publication. So that is why, and quite correctly, and to my pleasure, the government's response so far has been, we've received it, thank you very much, we're going to consider it. That is the best possible outcome you can get from doing a review like this. The alternative is a statement immediately of the government's opinion on all the items, and that almost always happens when people haven't read the detail and thought it through. So it is genuinely independent. It has not been influenced by government, departments, politicians, etc. And it is, for what it's worth, for better or worse, a view which I've been developing over the last 20 or 30 years, and I've intensively looked at over the last few months, as to how the costs of energy can be minimised while meeting the overall objectives of public policy. And the review itself is structured in essentially two main parts. What I do, first of all, is to sort out the building blocks, the framework, the context within which the cost of energy is set. And then I work systematically through the energy cost chain through generation, networks, supply, taxes and levies, and so on, with a view to working out what needs to be done in each of these areas if we are to minimise the cost of energy. And you might think, well, minimise the cost of energy, aren't we more concerned about the big items, etc.? I would say two things here. The first thing is that the cost of energy is a big cost of the household budgets of the entire population. And many people in here may find it easy to pay their electricity bills, but if you're at the even on the average household income, energy bills are a significant part of total expenditure, and they come alongside the transport bills, the water bills, the mortgage bills, etc. And these bills in the current context all set in a world where inflation has been relatively low, and the interest rates, well, in Britain, on the retail price index, the interest rate is minus 3.5 real. So if we're looking forward through the next decade or so, and any return to normal economic conditions, there are going to be some very big price rises for average households across the piece of their utility requirements and their housing requirements. And as I say, these things matter. You not only have to will the idea that people should be confronted with particular bills, but they actually have to be able to pay them. And if they aren't able to pay them, then your policy has severe difficulties. The second point, which I take most seriously, is the debate about the cost of energy, or rather the price of energy, is very, very capable, unless handled properly, of spilling over into people losing democratic support for decarbonisation and addressing climate change. And you already see that in a number of political parties. You can see it right across Europe. And it's all very well to ramp up people's bills. But if they scream and they've got other priorities, then the whole structure of the Climate Change Act and the things that people are trying to achieve comes under pressure. So it isn't a nice little luxury to look at the cost of energy. It's imperative to achieve our objectives at the minimum cost. And a very clear outcome of my review is that we certainly could do what we need to do at significantly lower cost than we're currently doing it. And I tried to explain why the cost of energy is so high for the relatively meager results we're achieving for those costs, but also practically how to drive them down. So I start with the building blocks and the framework, and then I go to the component parts. But before I do, you're not meant to be able to read this slide. There's another slide I've got up here which you're also not meant to read. But I would ask you always, when you look at a review like this, a review is the answer to a question. And the question is what the terms of reference say. So you might think that government goes round and just says, oh, we want to know about electric cars, we want to know about the cost of energy. Just write down whatever you think. That's not how it works. There are terms of reference. And these terms of reference were extremely well crafted. Don't bother to read them now, but I just want to highlight 2 or 3 things which condition the way in which the review is produced. The first thing to say is that there is a prohibition on specific tax reform proposals. And you might think, well, that rules out all sorts of stuff. Well, in a way it does. But imagine the government launching a review which makes explicit and specific tax proposals when it's the job of the Treasury to actually deal with those circumstances. And secondly, it rules out substantial additional public expenditure. Now, I think both of these prohibitions are extremely helpful, because if you think about if the review comes out and says the government should spend 200 million on the following things and $500 million on this, and it should spend something on this, the government will simply dismiss it. And if it says the government should axe this particular tax, introduce this particular tax, and do something different, again, there will be resistance. And then the overall framework will be lost. What the terms of reference do is focus on that framework so we can have a serious debate about the way forward rather than the particular component bits. The other point was, it said that the review would report by the end of October. Now, there were many people, well, 2 groups of people who responded to that particular request. The first were commentators who suggested that because it was being done quickly, it wouldn't be a proper review. In case you're surprised by that, you can go back and look at the Times, the Telegraph, the Financial Times, and everybody else. Well, if you thought about these things for about 20 years, another 2 or 3 months don't make any difference whatsoever. What you're required to do is set the framework out, and the longer you take, the more complicated the outcome will be. The second people who were extremely surprised were the civil servants, because I think they were utterly stunned that you could actually deliver this report early, because I think they thought end of October. We could always argue about a typo with regard to the 217. So it's all produced on time. But anyway, whenever you read a review, and this review, it's the answer to these terms of reference, not some general topic that I would like to write. In the same way as one says to students, you answer the exam question on the exam paper, not the exam question you would have liked to have had. So let's get to the substance. Okay? If you want to have an effective energy policy, there's an enormous premium on simplicity. Be very, very clear what it is that you want to achieve, and then design your policy to achieve those things. If you add more and more objectives, you will add more and more complexity. And every additional objective you add requires that you define the trade-offs with all the other objectives you've got. And the good news on the electricity side, and by the way, this is about electricity, and that's another constraint from the terms of reference, which I was delighted about. If you ask about electricity, there are really only 2 headline objectives that are objectives we wish to impose upon this system. The first is the decarbonisation objective, and from the point of view of my review, this is really easy, because there is a Climate Change Act. I think all bar about 3 MPs voted for it. there is no realistic prospect that anyone is going to repeal that act anytime soon. So that is a democratically established objective of government to achieve the outcome of the Climate Change Act. So anyone who says we want cheap energy has to say, no, we want the lowest cost of energy consistent with achieving the objective. Now, there are a lot of people running around who think that essentially lots of the decarbonisation stuff is too expensive. If only we can get rid of that, then we can have cheap energy. Well, might be true, but it's not an option because we're not going to drop the overall objective. So whether you're passionately concerned about climate change, whether you think the Climate Change Act is badly designed or not, my review takes that objective as given. Now, you have to be very clear what the objective is. The objective in the Climate Change Act is incredibly simple. It is a target for emissions reduction by 2050. Now, the Act adds other things, like the Climate Change Committee's requirement to come up with carbon budgets, these to be presented by Parliament, and Parliament to approve or revise. And I set out in some detail in the review what those details are. The Climate Change Act does not prescribe any particular pathway from here to 250. That's open. And whatever your views about climate change, unless you believe that technical change is going to be effectively zero, if all you wanted to do was achieve the target, you wouldn't go in a linear line from here to there. You'd do more later and less earlier. By the way, I'm not advancing that argument that we should do that. I'm simply saying that's what you do. But the Climate Change Committee didn't do that, and they haven't done that in their carbon budgets. And in the review, I go into some detail about how they presented the arguments for a linear line of decarbonisation, which supports the idea we should do early action. Now, there are plenty of reasons for doing early action, but if the objective is the Climate Change Act target, the only way you can get to the early action outcome is to assume two things, which they do. The first is they assume that gas prices will go up 30% by 2030, making the relative price of renewables lower than it otherwise would have been. And secondly, they assume effectively little or no technical change which will make much difference before 2050, except any technologies deployed at scale before 2030, by which I think they mean CCS. And since CCS is not going very well at the moment in terms of getting on with projects, effectively the Climate Change Committee assume that technology won't make much difference before 2050. So I draw the conclusion that if that's true, that they assume that to get their path, their linear path to 250, since I assume there's going to be a hell of a lot of technical progress, which I'll come on to in a moment, it means that we're probably going to achieve the target by 240. That's roughly the conclusion you would follow from the logic of that analysis. So we have the Climate Change Act, the carbon budgets, and the question is, what's the cheapest policy intervention, the most efficient policy intervention to achieve that carbon budget? And the answer is pretty unambiguous to me. It is that you would have a carbon price which is moves according to whatever level is necessary to achieve the target. And that's it. Not quite. There are lots of other things about R&D, etc. It's precisely the policy we don't have, right? But it actually is the most efficient way of achieving that objective. And we can debate some of the nuances around that, but I'd struggle if some of you thought that the carbon price would not play a significant role in achieving the target in the lowest cost frame. Now, the other objective is security of supply. We want to make sure the lights stay on at reasonable cost. Okay? You can always have security of supply. There is a price that will always equate supply and demand. But the kinds of prices that the private market might produce without the requirement of the system excess capacity to deal with spikes and variations is one which would produce prices which would be unacceptable. There'd be front page of the Sun, Lecky price hits 2,000 and whatever. You can just see the headline and you can see what the cartoonist would do with that. It happened in California in 2000 and the political reaction is fast and swift. So we need to make sure we've got enough capacity That's the answer, roughly, to the question of security supply. And I propose an equivalent firm power auction as the solution to that problem. You just auction however much capacity you need to keep the lights on. So the carbon price looks after the meeting the carbon budgets. The equivalent firm power auctions auction enough capacity to have enough capacity. QED, there's nothing else you need to worry about, apart from R&D and a few other industrial policy things. That's the first best outcome. Now, of course, we're not going to do the first best outcome anytime soon, but it's absolutely crucial that you're clear what the best answer is to your question before you deal with the complexities which are introduced by the political constraints and all the other components. Now, in order to achieve, this is the other slide you're not meant to be able to read any words of. In order to achieve these objectives, you might think, so you have a capacity auction, you have a carbon price, maybe you have FITs, etc. But that's all you need. What we have in Britain is a degree of complexity and multiple interventions which defies any civil servant or any company executive to recite. So I asked the officials to devise me a list of all the current interventions in the energy market. I said, just do the major ones. And I reproduced in the document. It's 3 pages of it. Right? That's before you get anywhere near the regulation or anything else. So every time there's another problem, you put a bit of sticky plaster on it. And the sticky plaster has unintended consequence on all the other interventions you've got. But you can never remove these interventions because every intervention creates an economic rent which is capitalized in someone's profit and loss account or someone's asset value. So it's a separate issue in a sense, but the political economy of intervention in any of these areas, you can see it in agriculture as another example, is that complexity breeds unintended consequences. And you can't actually work out the cost benefits of any of these interventions because the complexities of the interaction with each of these interventions with all the others is so great that you couldn't compute it. So the reason I put this up here is that this complexity and the inability of both the governmental side, the regulator side, and the industry side to understand what's going on is likely to be a serious source of inefficiency. And I put the proposition forward, tampering with it, having a little bit of a go at, say, this one or that one over there, isn't going to solve your problem about having high costs of energy. You have to start from first principles. What are the objectives you need, and what are the minimum number of instruments you need to achieve those objectives? Now, so that's the objectives, clearing them up, sorting out the complexity of the interventions. Now, the next thing is the legacy. It turns out that one of the major costs in the electricity sector, 20% of the cost, is made up of the legacy contracts from essentially the renewables obligation and some of the FITs. That's 100 quid in 500 quid. Right? Now, it's often been very dangerous to point this out because everyone concludes, oh, if you're pointing out the legacy costs and the renewables obligation, the FITs are causing bills to be higher, you must be against renewables. I've been accused of that on repeated occasions. Not a bit of it. The serious question about these legacy costs is what's the most efficient and fairest way of getting them paid for, because we can't renege on the contracts? And what are the lessons we learn from the fact that we have achieved very little for a very, very large sum of money? Now, the good news is the cost of renewables has been tumbling. The good news, and I think actually even more important, is the cost of intermittency has been tumbling. So if you look out into the future, the costs of decarbonisation are not in anything like the order of magnitude they have been in the past. So what I suggest in this territory is these legacy costs should be separated out from the current costs of the marketplace, so we can get on with the normal market and roll forward with these cheaper alternatives, and they're put in essentially a legacy bank, and then there's a choice. Who should pay those legacy costs? Now, Somewhat controversially, I say industry shouldn't. And that reflects the position which is nearly true anyway here and is very true in Germany, because of the impact on competition and effects that plays through, and there are other ways of taxing industry if you want to do it. By the way, I say industry should pay the price of carbon, which is quite separate. Now, there are lots of options as to how to recover those costs. You decide who should pay, how they should pay, but I take it as given that you shouldn't renege on the contracts. I can't propose in this review any public expenditure. But I note this week that the chief executive of Centrica said these costs should be put on a socialised basis on the government's balance sheet. That's clearly one option, but I didn't propose it because it's outside my terms of reference. But we have to deal with those. And we've got more legacy costs to come. Hinkley will almost certainly be a legacy cost. We've got a lot more contracts which are already committed to, which are going to run through. And then we've got all the legacy costs associated with old coal, old nuclear, and all those component parts. And none of that's going to go away, and that's very significant. So, objectives, recognise the complexity of the interventions, think hard about how to handle the legacy costs, and then think through what the technological base, and therefore the cost structure, and therefore the policy framework ought to be going into the future. Now, this is absolutely fundamental to my review, and I take it to be the most important point of the review, and it's core to my burnout book. Almost everything you know about the electricity industry for the last 100 years plus has been based upon vertically integrated companies where the wholesale market is absolutely crucial. The wholesale market, positive marginal costs, is where the economic guts of the industry takes place. And because the industry didn't have much, any really, storage, and because demand was passive, the vertical integration was required in order to ensure that security of supply could be met and the upstream generation could be certain of a downstream market to extract the costs to reward its sunk costs upstream. So the vertical integrated structures, the big six, etc., although they're basically all already broken up, the big six, EDF, CEGB, RWE, are the answer to three questions. Marginal cost driving the system through wholesale markets, no storage, and passive demand. Now, I think the technology is going to turn all three of those on their heads. In fact, completely invert them. In fact, I think it's already doing it. So I think the marginal cost of the renewables, etc., well, the marginal cost of some of the renewables is already zero, but as we decarbonise, most of the carbonising technologies are zero marginal cost. There is no wholesale market if you have no marginal costs. Now, not forecasting the wholesale market's going to wither away tomorrow morning. It isn't. It's going to take time. But the guts of the industry shifts from being a wholesale-driven industry to a capacity-driven industry. So the economics of electricity become like the economics of broadband. The marginal cost of using the broadband, except if you have a rural one like I do, is pretty close to zero. You buy a capacity package, and that's how you're going to buy energy. Okay? And the second thing is that we're going to have more and more solutions to the intermittency problem. That's storage, that's batteries, electric cars, all that stuff coming onto the system. And that means that the problem of dealing with the intermittency and the capacity side is going to get easier, and that means we get to more and more firm power type of capacity market, which we'll come on to in a moment. And then the active demand side means that we can shed demand rather than build new generation or build new networks. And as I explained in a moment, that's absolutely critical to breaking down the license structure between distribution, supply, and generation, particularly at the local level. Now, it's a fundamental point of economics, unless Cameron tells me I've got this wrong, that the structure of an industry reflects the underlying cost structure of that industry, and the cost structure of that industry reflects the underlying technologies of that industry. So if the technology changes radically, then the existing structures change, and so does the nature of the policy intervention. That's why I believe whatever governments do in the next weeks or months or years, they're going to end up with my system. Because it has to have an answer to my questions about the technology. And if you think about it, this isn't a technology issue just about electricity. If you look at the economy as a whole, it's digitalizing. Robotics, 3D printing, artificial intelligence, all of these technologies have two characteristics in common. One is they're almost all electric. That's why the future is electricity in energy, and that's why decarbonisation is very much about electricity. And they're all pretty close to zero marginal cost. So I have this world of zero marginal cost, more storage, active demand side. What sort of electricity system and what sort of industry structure answers that technological frame? And part of it's in my book, but the Energy Review builds that out. So now let me take you through the energy cost chain and explain how the bits that I've just referred to are played out in the components of the industry. So I'm going to take generation first, then I'm going to look at networks, then I'm going to look at supply, then I'm going to look at levies. And it's a bit of a pedestrian set of steps, but they all fit together, and that's what the review's about. So, generation. Now, generation is now about wholesale markets, capacity, feed-in tariffs. It's about capacity and energy, and over time it'll be more about capacity and less about energy. The wholesale markets, I diverge somewhat from the Competition and Markets Authority, in I think there have been quite significant and potentially serious problems of market power in generation. But I'm less concerned about that going forward because more and more zero marginal cost generation spilling into the electricity market means that the price is capped. So it's the zero marginal cost wind, solar, etc., and nuclear as well, of course, that's spilling into the system, which means that even if there's market power there, it's not possible to exploit it. So I'm relaxed about the wholesale market. On the capacity and the fits side, there are, however, significant steps that can be taken. On the capacity side, we've already seen that auctions have produced costs which are substantially lower than anyone expected would be the outcome of those auctions. Auctions really work. They've also brought in technologies people didn't expect. On the fits, introducing an element of auctioning has also reduced the costs, and we've seen that in some of the recent offshore wind auctions. They may not be necessarily representative of everything that's to come, but we've already seen those in the frame. Now, I combine the capacity and the fits market together because I've dealt with carbon through the carbon price, and I say we need to auction firm power in order to ensure that we meet a capacity margin. However, as someone in this audience pointed out to me when I was thinking about these things, and remain nameless, but he's smiling in the front row, second row, of course, just because something's intermittent doesn't mean that having you on the system doesn't add something to security of supply. If you have to bid firm capacity, then if you cause intermittency, you have to deal with the consequences and face the cost that your intermittency causes. But that cost depends upon the characteristic of the system. So the offshore wind farms add something to the security of the system, but not 100% firm capacity. And so what I propose is equivalent firm power capacity, and that basically derates the intermittent stuff. Now, over time, the intermittent stuff in my system will realise that it's in their interest to contract with people who will offset their intermittency, to make common investments with energy supply businesses, to think of a whole range of ways in which they can reduce their costs of intermittency onto the system. But the equivalent firm power auction plus the gradually diminishing wholesale price is what I set up into generation. Under networks, there's quite a lot which I haven't got time to take you through here about the way peer reviews and regulation works and identify how the companies have outperformed due to, in the main, mistaken assumptions made by regulators in the current periods. And of course, people are paying those costs. But I set out a framework for networks going forward, which is very different from the current regulatory framework. And I'll explain that a bit further down the road, but essentially what I do is I not only find options to deal with the existing outperformance, without recommending any in particular, but I set out how the system operator model can gradually replace the Ofgem regulation of networks. Somewhat technical, but it's absolutely crucial to the architecture, as I'll explain in a moment. Supply. Well, supply is another whole topic in its own right, and again, I haven't really got time to go through it in much detail, but one of the things that astonished me when I looked at the margins that suppliers were charging to their customers was that most of the margins were on costs that the companies were passing through. So when you pay a margin on your electricity bill, you're paying a margin on the levies. You're paying a margin on the transmission and distribution review. You're paying a levy on the capacity contracts, the FITs. You're paying on the wholesale cost. Almost all of that is not under the control of the companies. They're just collecting the revenues. And once you sort out what the margin is of the cost they actually control, as opposed to the margin on the cost they don't control, which is a cost pass-through and a revenue collection mechanism, you find the margins very, very different from the ones reported. So I got people in BES to recalculate the margins, taking out the exogenous elements. And if anyone wants to, if anyone has doubts about whether there really is a problem in supply, and whether there is a problem of abuse of market power, etc., as found by the Competition and Markets Authority, I would point you to the section in my report which identifies what the true margins actually are. And then I'd be happy to have a conversation if people thought that wasn't a problem, but I suspect it is a serious problem, and I propose a particular way of addressing that, which doesn't regulate most of the market, but focuses on the costs the companies can control. But that's a whole topic in its own right. Tax and levy, a mess. Taxes and levies have been developed ad hoc, one after another. So in fact, there are 7 different taxes and levies in the electricity sector, and they have implicit taxes through the price in the EU ETS. They have VAT on some things but not others. Fuel duties are a very important part, which is going to come to bear through the transport sector. Then there's the carbon floor price, there's the climate change commitment, and there's a host of related bits. I propose very simply that we should harmonise these levies and focus on the thing we ought to be taxing, which is carbon, rather than energy per se, and I propose we can go down one of 2 routes. Either we can generalise the floor price of carbon across all these various instruments, or we can develop the fuel duty into a tax on coal, tax on oil, and tax on gas. Much of this will have to happen because as the transport sector electrifies, cars become more efficient, government's going to lose the money. And in taxation policy, follow the money is a good rule to adopt. But there's a big opportunity to do here. There's a whole bit associated with this with border carbon adjustments, which I deal with in the report, and which Cameron and I have written about in the past, but that's part of the frame too. And that links back to my point at the beginning about having a carbon price as a core instrument for achieving the objective. I propose a default tariff for the supply part, for the price cap that's currently being discussed. I won't labour that here, but I set out in some detail the default tariff I think ought to be adopted, why that ought to be provided to all customers as an option, and as a side, why companies pretending they're abolishing the standard variable tariff are not really doing anything that looks like that, but the need for a default tariff remains in place. But that's also part of the frame. Now that brings me to the long-term framework, which I always want to leave these framework ideas with you. So I have my 2 objectives, Climate Change Act and security of supply, and I have my 2 instruments, carbon price and the equivalent firm power auction. If you don't want to do the carbon price properly, then you have to doctor the equivalent firm power auction to make sure that the capacity contracts that are awarded are consistent with the carbon budgets as agreed by Parliament and as set out by the Climate Change Committee. So if you don't want to do the carbon price, or you're only going to do it imperfectly, which seems to me the most likely outcome, then you have to have a two-stage auction equivalent firm power, or you have to have an auction which deliberately specifies the carbon criteria. Now, how do you get these things done? And this is the last point I really want to leave you with. Okay, someone's got to do these auctions. Okay, now we have a system operator inside National Grid which does the capacity auctions. Okay, and there is, I argue in my report, a fundamental conflict of interest between a system operator whose job is to work out what we need for the system as a whole as an act of public policy with discretion, and a private sector company which has grid assets, loads of engineering capabilities to enter all these markets and lots of opportunities. So I propose that the system operator should be a national system operator separate from National Grid, and that national system operator should receive clear guidance from government as to the required security, margins, etc., and that then those are auctioned by this body. No assets, it's just, if you like, and it's not the right term, but it's essentially the system planner to make sure the whole thing adds up, and of course, consistent with the Climate Change Act as well. So my two objectives at the national level go through the system operator, and since I take cybersecurity extremely seriously, I do not believe that you can have a system operator that does not have discretion. Imagine one day MI5 or MI6 decide there's a possible security threat to our energy systems from some hostile power. I think they do that every day now. Do they go and say, we've been told this, so this is the prohibitions and constraints on the capacity auction, so you all know? Or do they say, we will exercise discretion to make sure the system maintains its integrity, and we can't tell you why we're doing it? You have to have some discretion. And when you realise from a point of view of national security, disabling an electricity system through a cyber kind of attack is now a really serious issue. You can't leave that with a private sector company. This has to be in the public domain. But the revolution I want to have isn't at the national level. I want there to be regional system operators for each of the regions within the system, so that they help the transition towards the decentralized component of our future energy systems. And now I want them to auction not just generation at the local level, but rather security at the local level, and invite the market to open up bids from the energy demand side, from energy efficiency services, from local generation, renewables and others, and from the networks. And if you want to do that, which I think is essential to take that technology forward, you have to abolish the distinction between distribution, generation, supply licenses. Now, the final twist is my system operators auction the network requirements, and therefore they take over the job of Ofgem. And then you can have longer-term contracts, shorter-term contracts, contracts that challenge distributors as whether network bits need to be built as opposed to demand-side pieces, etc. No assets, simply an auctioning framework, but now breaking down that structure which we put in place for the last 20 or 30 years as part of the internal energy market and a part of the unbundling of the energy systems. So this is only a thumbnail sketch of what I tried to do in the report, but I think that's the framework within which a increasingly capacity-driven, decarbonising, digitalised electricity system will go forward. And what I observe on a daily basis is that the old vertical structure is crumbling all over the place as people realise the cost implications. The latest is the attempt by two of the big six to divest supply. Not a very good idea to merge them together and create more market power, but that's an aside. But the divestment, you've seen the breakup of Aon, you've seen the breakup of RWE, You've seen the exit of many of them from networks. These structures are crumbling all around us. What we need is a framework to make sure that the new structures that emerge, not that we're terribly prescriptive about it, but these new structures go with the grain of decarbonisation and go with the grain of technical change in general, without having to predict the particular bits. So that's my long-term framework, and that's what I've tried to establish in the review, and that's what I hope the government will go away and think about, not jump to any conclusions. And if you wish to comment on any of the detail, as Cameron said, there is now a call for evidence, I think till about the 8th of January, but really interesting, you can only write 2,000 words on the 3 topics that are identified, which turns it into a sensible process as opposed to the usual now call for evidence, where you have to have teams of civil servants reading meters and meters of documentation in order to elicit particular outcomes. So that's it. I hope it spurs discussion. Much of it may be wrong, but I'm very much hopeful that people will use the framework I've set out to have the debate that's necessary, because otherwise I fear, if we go on as we're going at the moment, the cost of energy will undermine the democratic commitment to decarbonisation, and all the things which many people have struggled to try to achieve in the energy system will come to a political dead end. It's not an option to have the lowest cost consistent with the objectives. It's absolutely essential. And hopefully I've made some small contribution to helping that process.
Thank you, Dieter, for a fantastic overview of what is obviously a very wide-ranging and important review at an important time. So we have now just over 10 minutes for questions. You said you hoped it would provoke discussion. I've got no doubt that it has done. I can already see 3 hands. So let's start at the back and move forwards.
Would you give the evidence for the claim you made that there will be technological innovation?
Thanks, and you should just state your name and affiliation too.
Tom, independent, interested person.
Okay, all right. Very, very informative. Thank you, Tom. Yeah. There's one over the other side too. Yep. Yes, that's right. Still up the back. Yeah, well, that's fine. Keep going. Yep, great.
You go that side, I'll go this side.
Matt Prescott. Can I ask if you expect to include nuclear in the equivalent firm power backup, as it can drop off in seconds and need backup as well as the intermittent renewables?
Excellent, thank you very much. And third question, I'm particularly looking for any women who may wish to ask a question. Okay, Chris, you'll substitute for a woman. So up here at the front.
DJ, you mentioned very briefly...
Take the mic, please.
Microphone.
You very briefly mentioned border carbon adjustments, which raised in my mind, can this be is Brexit a necessary condition for us to do this?
Okay.
Could it be done if we were still in the EU, however logical?
Okay, so there's 3. So I think the question was, what's the evidence for technical change? Well, I don't know, I can't predict exactly what technical change is going to take place. What I can tell you, though, is a hell of a lot is taking place. Right? So you don't have to buy the prediction, and I'm not really making a prediction, that we're all going to be digitalised, to see just how much difference robotics and AI and 3D printing are already making. And the point I make in the review, too, is that not only are these technologies which are already in shape with us, I could mention graphene, all sorts of materials, all sorts of other stuff going on too, and I can add to that I think it's essential that we have technical change to do decarbonisation, because I don't believe the existing technologies are going to get us there. But if you look through those effects, they're already with us, they're out there, and they undermine the market. Why do you think the wholesale price is 40 and not £92.50, as DEC forecast it would be, which is conveniently the same number as the Hinkley contract? So I think I just take that as given. If it doesn't happen and we stay with where we are, even where we are at the moment, my RSOs and my NSO make sense, so does my carbon price, and so does my equivalent firm power auction. So it's not dependent on there being rapid technical change, but it says if there is rapid technical change, and if it goes down these general directions we already know about, then these are the sorts of structures you want. On the nuclear question, so I meant to say this on the terms of reference. One of the things I insisted on being in the terms of reference was that I would not comment on any particular projects, because otherwise it would have turned into a jamboree about Hinckley or the tidal lagoon or something like that. And I would have lost the plot for the rest of it, and the press and everyone else and the politicians would have lost the plot. Now, there's no reason on earth why nuclear shouldn't bid in these auctions, except that nuclear has certain societal, and I would say political, and social, and actually economic consequence over its time span, that I make the point, and I've always made this point, that in the end nuclear power ends up being a political choice. And it always will be a political choice, and it will never be a private sector outcome. Now, but the point about the intermittency, you're absolutely right. Hinckley creates a serious intermittency problem, because you don't know in 225 whether there's going to be another 7 gigawatts on the system or none. Right? So who pays the cost of building, for example, I'm not recommending this, but for example, 2 or 3 gas stations just in case the thing doesn't turn up on time? This is a really serious problem of intermittency. And the investors who develop that thing create that cost for the rest of us on the system. And that intermittency cost has not been included in the economics of Hinckley, and it ought to be. So the principles of my firm power auctions, or equivalent firm powers, ought to be included, but that still won't be enough to decide whether to build nuclear. That has to be a political outcome. On the border carbon adjustments, and Cameron and I have written a lot about this, there are border adjustments. If you look at all the interventions to give special deals for different bits of industry, right? You know, exemptions from this bit, exemptions from that, intensive energy players. These are all proxies for a carbon border adjustment, and they're incredibly inefficient. Okay? So that's the first point. Secondly, can we do it? I haven't really thought about the Brexit issue, but clearly we're going to have freedom to do quite a lot of this, which might have been somewhat limited by the Europeans. But I observe across Europe that we're developing carbon floor prices virtually everywhere. The French are in favour of this. The Poles were once in favour of it because they wanted actually a top rather than a bottom level. You can see that the political economy of having to start with a relatively low carbon price across most of Europe is becoming almost overwhelming because they run out of money from other tax bases. And I think this is very practically doable, and I discuss it in some detail. And I think, you know, the climate change levy, the exemptions from that, the bits that identify, you know, very intensive energy users rather than less. This is a total muddle. You want a common carbon price, and if you're going to have a common carbon price, you want to apply it at the border. And we're going to be doing all this customs stuff anyway, so presumably all these new customs officials we're going to have dealing with the queues of lorries at Dover can deal with that problem as well.
Fantastic, thank you. Now, another 3 questions, and I'm still looking for a female somewhere.
There's one there.
Oh, yes,
one
great.
there.
Yes, thank you very much. Sarah.
I've been a paid-up female for a long time.
Good.
Sarah Darby.
Far more credible than Chris.
Sarah Darby from the Environmental Change Institute and the Martin School, where I work on the programme for integrating renewables. I would like to hear a little, please, about what assumptions you are making about the future of heating and transport. This is an energy review, but as you said, it is primarily about electricity, and you are making the assumption, I think, that both heating and transport will be electrified. That's a very enormous assumption on the demand side, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Perfect, thanks very much. Now, there's quite a few up the front. I know you're in dire need up the back, but do come forwards because let's have 1 and 2 there.
Rupert Stewart-Smith, the President of the Oxford Climate Society. If we are to enhance our current ambition in line with Articles 2 and 4 of the Paris Agreement, how will that affect the future cost of energy?
Okay.
And the gentleman there.
I'm Hugh Lee, an independent consultant. You said just now that nuclear was always going to be a political decision. Is carbon capture and storage similarly always going to be a political decision?
All right, and can I give you one more?
Yeah, of course you can.
All right,
Yeah.
right up the front.
Yeah.
Oliver.
Oliver Tickell, the ecologist. I'm fascinated by this question of firm power equivalent and what it actually means. You know, it sounds fantastically simple, but when you start to think about it, you realise it's actually it has to be a statistical construct. And it's a very complex statistical construct, which comes complete with all kinds of confidence limits. And it's actually, actually to define what it is and how on earth people are going to deliver it is a very difficult thing. But it looks to me superficially as if it could be a means of favouring nuclear power. The reason being that nuclear power produces an essentially flat output, except for when it isn't delivering anything at all.
Okay, I'll deal with that. That's fine. That's absolutely fine. I'll deal with that.
So derating
Definitely.
factors and so
Okay, yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
Right, okay. So heating and transport, okay? I should have said, on the terms of reference, those aren't included, right? Because in 30 or 60 days, if I was to do heating and transport, I need to do another complete review, okay? So that nothing says that they're not important, okay? But by the way, nothing in my review says that I assume they're going to be electrified by any particular timetable. Okay? So on the heating side, you'll know much more about this than I do, but there are lots of options, including gas-based options, hydrogen, and so on and so forth. And heating is really difficult. So my simple answer to you is there needs to be another review of heating, and then it ought to be integrated with what I've done too. On the transport side, I make passing reference to this. I'm very sceptical about the some of the scenarios which require a very large amount of new generation to be built in order to do electric cars. Some of the work done in Oxford suggests that there's much scope for incorporating those within the existing systems. But again, huge amount to do, but I did my 250 pages. I would have been here for another year to do both those things as well. So not a satisfactory answer, but I didn't need to make assumptions to give the structure I've got here. And by the way, particularly on the transport side, my regional system operators open up lots of opportunities for battery and storage, which aren't available given the silos we have on the licenses. So my RSOs are really consistent with doing that at the regional level as well as the national level. On the Paris point, okay, so the bit I left out was, there are actually three objectives, okay, in terms of public policy. Carbon targets, security of supply, and R&D, okay, because the market will not deliver optimal R&D. And one of the things I was very keen on doing, and there's some stuff in the budget today, and by the way, my report was timed to come out before the budget and the industrial strategy paper. I think the industrial strategy paper is determined next week. That's, by the way, why the timetable's so short. Okay, the industrial strategy and the budget, from an energy perspective, should, in my view, focus on that R&D side. Okay, now as the question of the costs, is it going to be expensive to achieve the Paris outcomes? Well, if you have a structure like we've got at the moment, yes, it's incredibly inefficient, right? But it doesn't need to be like that. And if you look at the speed with which the costs are falling, on the renewable side, if you look at some of the technical things that are going on, if you look at what's happening to intermittency, cost, storage, etc., and you put these structures in place, and you look at the scope on the demand side to do stuff on that side, by the way, it's the energy efficiency services which are the main driver of my energy efficiency side, there's no reason why it should be more expensive to decarbonise. But we won't get anywhere towards the decarbonisation if we have an incredibly inefficient system like this drive up the price of energy to customers on the basis of having inefficiently high costs and undermine the democratic commitment to the outcome. Because in the end, voters have to support that frame. On the last point about equivalent firm power, I mean, there are two bits. One is, does it favour nuclear? I mean, if you look at the costs of nuclear as it's currently constructed, and you add to that the costs of intermittency, what I'm saying is the costs of nuclear are higher than is implied by the £92.50 megawatt hour. You can take what you like of that, okay? Now, on the derating and the complexity, it's not that complicated. In fact, National Grid already derates all the different kinds of technology because it's just a question of their impact on the portfolio of the system as a whole. But because the intermittent stuff is rewarded with fits, it isn't in the capacity auction. So I'm not adding anything extra to what's currently done. But there's one final thing I think is very important. Security of supply is a hit and miss job. You don't know what demand in 5 years' time is going to be, and you don't know which bits of capacity are going to fall over and whether everyone's going to deliver. Therefore, you put a cushion in place. So let me give an example. I spent a lot of time in the last decade saying, if we go on like we're going, by 2011, the system's going to be very, very tight and security of supply will be in serious risk. And people who say, nah, of course it's fine, you don't need capacity markets, it's all going to be okay. Well, the reason it's okay is because GDP is 25% below the level now that you would have predicted it to be in 2007 before the crisis. Right? These are huge variances in demand on systems. So for society's point of view and for a modern functioning economy, you want to be comfortably assured that you're going to have enough capacity. If you have too much capacity, it's a cost on everyone, but it's spread across 60 million people and all the companies. If you have too little, the costs are enormous and they're very painful. So in the end, you build a comfort factor in. And I'm not content with a world where we get between 1 and 4 or 5% capacity margin. I would have something bigger. And the more you think it's complicated and uncertain, the slightly bigger you build the margin. But this idea, there's some precise idea of exactly what margin you want. Look, just roughly go there. 10%? Choose a number and go for there. And then give the system operator, the national system operator, the discretion that if things look tricky, like the coal stations fall over early, etc., they've got the scope to bring forward more auctions to get more capacity into the system. But live with the fact we'll end up with having too much rather than too little. You asked me about, what did you ask me about?
I didn't ask you anything.
Okay.
CCS.
You know, I mean, this is an R&D problem. Okay? And so it is a political choice about R&D. How much do you want to spend? And I've got myself in lots of trouble in the past of suggesting if you spend X tens of billion on offshore wind to develop offshore wind, it seems extraordinary that you wouldn't find 1 billion to try out a CCS project, given that if we're really interested in global warming, and you think that CCS might have a role to play, the best place in the world, as I understand, to try it out is in shallow, empty fields in the North Sea with pipes already connected to them. So I'm not against spending money on offshore wind and other things, but this is a question of priorities. And we got our political priorities in allocating R&D money seriously badly wrong. Okay? So policy question 1, how much should you spend on R&D? Policy question 2, how should you allocate that? Okay? And then you have to decide, and that's because your question was about Paris, right? You know, we might have our own targets, etc., but global warming is global. So we have to ask, what is the biggest contribution this country can make to the global efforts to reduce carbon emissions? We have a great site for offshore wind, so should we try that? Okay? We have a great sites for CCS, so of course you should try it. Right? Why wouldn't you against the other options? So that's my answer on CCS.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Now, you said that you hoped that you would provoke questions. You have done. My apologies to those of you whose hands were up, but there are drinks next door in the cafe. Dieter is a man of the people, both in practice and self-described, so he will be there having a drink. But before you go next door, 2 things for me to do. First, this has been an Oxford Energy Colloquium event joint with the Oxford Martin School. The next Energy Colloquium is on flexibility. It's by Phil Grunwald, who is here. It's on the 28th of November. So do come along to that, but it will be in the School of Geography and Environment, not here. Following this one, forthcoming events, we have one on reproduction and empowerment, the future of women in Africa, here Thursday the 30th of November at 5 p.m. Climate science following the Paris Agreement, what next, from the chief scientist of the Met Office, again here Thursday the 7th of December at 4 p.m. And in the new year, Antarctica, the battle for the 7th continent, on Wednesday the 31st of January at 5 p.m. But it remains for me to thank Dieter for a fantastic talk, fantastic overview, and I'm sure you'll be bombarded by questions while you have your glass of champagne. Thank you all for coming. See you soon.